You heard earlier today that Minister Gentiloni said that you are not well advised to build walls around nations that are embedded in an integrated, globalizing, socially integrated economy. What I want to talk about today is what happened when somebody tries to do this. In the early 1980s, Mexico led Latin America into a broader financial crisis. It was the climax of the old system of import substitution industrialization, state-led development, heavily protected economy. Mexico had been financing it on debt for a decade or so, mortgaged against future oil revenues that suddenly in 1982 didn't materialize, causing a financial crisis. And this pushed Mexico decidedly away from import substitution towards a new neoliberal restructuring of the economy, which entailed getting the government out of markets, encouraging private investment, opening the country to trade and foreign investment. And in 1985, with strong support from the US and the IMF and the World Bank, Mexico dropped its commitment to import substitution and joined the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. In 1988, President Carlos Salinas came into power with a mandate to continue the neoliberal reforms, and he pursued even greater privatization and restructuring the economy. And because the president in Mexico was a very powerful figure, and one at that point picked one's successor as president, and even if you pick your successor, you can't guarantee what your successor is going to do. Being a shrewd politician, he realized that the way to guarantee that these reforms would stay in place was to link them into a treaty with its much more powerful neighbors to the north. The Mexican president would be hard-pressed to unilaterally break a negotiated trade agreement with the United States. And a trade agreement would cause a whole series of consequent changes that would make it ever more difficult to go back to the status quo ante. So he approached the US and Canada and asked to become part of a new trade agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was successfully negotiated and went into effect on January 1st, 1994. In 1994, as we began a formalized process of integrating markets in the United States, increasing cross-border movements of goods, capital, information, services. We launched a border operation called Operation Gatekeeper in the busiest border crossing point in an attempt to block the movement of labor, specifically undocumented migrants. And really, the effort to go back to the effort to stop cross-border movements through a militarization of the border goes back to 1986 and the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And it accelerates in the early 1990s with Operation Blockade and Operation Gatekeeper, accelerates after 1996 with new streamlined operations for the Border Patrol, and accelerates exponentially after 2001 with all the legislation following from 9/11, especially the USA Patriot Act. And so we have a case here where two countries are in the process of very dramatic and wholesale economic integration that is radically transforming Mexican society far more than it's transforming American society, but changing things on both sides of the border. And rather than trying to figure out a way to bring movements of labor and people into this integrated economy that we're creating, we militarized the border with our second largest or first largest trading partner. What I want to show is how this came about, what happened, what the consequences were, and it's a fable about how bad things can happen when you try to prevent autogenous processes that are happening as part of a broader regime of trade and integration, and you try to just stop one element of the broader process of integration. So to understand how we got to this point, you need a little history. What we have here is, this is all official US statistical data. And we go back to the 1950s, and the last big border militarization was called Operation Wetback in 1954. And that was a full-scale militarization of the border where not only the Border Patrol was involved, National Guard was involved, local sheriffs were involved. It was a full-scale effort to apprehend and return all Mexican immigrants in the United States without documentation. And as quickly as it happened, it disappeared. And if you listen to certain people in the US today, they'll say, well, if we had another Operation Wetback, a full-scale deportation campaign and militarization, we could solve the problem. But what really solved the problem was Congress's quiet expansion of guest worker migration. So this guest worker program goes back to World War II. It was small in scale. In the post-war economic boom, growers couldn't get workers because now they were working in unionized factory jobs in defense industries in California. The Okies were all well employed by then. And so there were labor shortages. And that prompted the rise in undocumented migration. And then about the same time that they launched Operation Wetback, Congress quietly expanded the guest worker program to about 450,000 entries per year. Legal permanent entries are going at about 50,000 per year. So in the late 1950s, the US is taking in about 500,000 Mexicans per year into the labor market. The vast majority are circulating back and forth, and we know from a lot of data that even people with permanent resident visas were actually circulating back and forth to a high degree. And this all changes in 1965 with the 1965 amendments to the Immigration and Nationality Act, which some people think, oh, well, this created all the Latino immigration. But in point of fact, Latino migration in the United States occurred in spite of, despite of, not because of, the 1965 amendments, which imposed the first ever numerical limitations on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. Prior to 1965, there was no numerical limits on the number of people from Mexico who could legally enter the United States. And Mexico benefited from a guest worker program of 450,000 workers. In 1965, the Immigration Act begins a process of restricting the new numbers of entries from the Western Hemisphere, ramping it down to a hemispheric quota in 1968, and imposing country quotas by 1976. So, and in 1965, Congress unilaterally terminates the guest worker program. It goes to zero after a rapid phase out. So you go from the late 50s, when 500,000 Mexicans were circulating in and out every year, mostly in and out, some permanent, to a new situation by the late 1970s, where Mexican permanent resident visas are limited to 20,000 per country per year, and there's no guest worker program at all. So what happened? What happened was the flows simply reestablished themselves under undocumented auspices. And we're measuring undocumented migration here with apprehensions divided by Border Patrol officers. The number of apprehensions is a function of the number of people looking to catch them. So if you put more Border Patrol officers on the border, you're going to catch more migrants. And you divide by the number of people, the size of the Border Patrol provides a rough control. And I'm not saying that this is the exact volume of migration, but it's an indicator. It's a good indicator of the relative volume. And you see what happened is that by in the late 1970s, the flows basically reestablished themselves under undocumented auspices. And then they fluctuated a lot, but were no longer rising. And they basically started to trend down and eventually got down to zero. But the key point is that there doesn't seem to be much of an increase, wholesale increase in undocumented migration after about 1979. However, this provided a great opportunity for a lot of people, because suddenly what had been a legal flow of migrants that was largely invisible to people became a very visible illegal flow. And since the migrants were illegal, by definition, they were criminals and lawbreakers, and allowed entrepreneurs in government and in politics and in the media to frame this as a new crisis, because if they're criminals and lawbreakers, they're a grave threat to American society. What I've got here I did a ProQuest newspaper search of the three principal leading newspapers, foreign newspapers, Chicago Tribune, Washington Post, New York Times, and LA Times and Wall Street Journal. And what you see is that in 1965, no newspaper was talking about the immigration, mentioning immigration as a crisis, flood, or invasion. And then as illegal migration increases, it goes up. And then about 1979, when we saw the flows level off and begin to fluctuate, these also begin to fluctuate. But with each peak, there's another piece of anti-immigrant legislation or border mobilization policy that is enacted, and that becomes a dynamic. And I've actually written a paper in Population Development Review where I actually tried to parameterize what's going on over time. And what you see here is the exogenous shock, cutting off the flow, cutting off opportunities for legal entry, which produces illegal entries, which produces apprehensions. And this leads to conservative mobilization, which produces restrictive legislation, more Border Patrol agents, bigger budgets, more restrictive operations, all of which goes into create an increase in line watch hours, the number of hours spent patrolling the border looking to catch people. And then line watch hours, of course, in and of itself is going to produce more apprehensions. And so what happened, what started as an exogenous effect here became an endogenous self-feeding chain, where apprehensions would rise. That would allow entrepreneurs in government and outside of government to claim we're being invaded, and this is the proof that we're being invaded. As apprehensions are rising, they get more restrictive legislation, more budget, more Border Patrol hours, and they catch more apprehensions, which again further convinces people that we need more line watch hours, more enforcement effort. And this is what happens. This is the absolute number of apprehensions, and this is the one where you control for the enforcement effort. And so you see apprehension just going skyrocketing, but the volume is probably not really increasing. It's all a function of your greater enforcement effort. And this is the ultimate result. This is the militarization of the border in constant 2013 dollars from 1970 to 2010. And you see that from 70 to about 1985, it was flat. This is the Border Patrol's budget. It's fairly modest. It's down in the hundreds of millions. And then suddenly, with the passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, it begins to rise. And then it accelerates in the 1990s with the border blockade operations, and then the 1996 legislation. And then after 9/11 and the USA Patriot Act, it just goes through the roof. And remember that all the data seem to suggest that the rate of the volume of undocumented immigration had stabilized somewhere way back here. So all this is going on despite the fact that there's not an underlying increase in the volume. And probably by the later years, we're pretty sure it was a sizable decline. So what I'm going to assert now, and then show you some evidence to back this up, is that the militarization of the border that we just observed had some serious and powerful effects on border outcomes. First, it transformed the geography of border crossing, shifting the flows from traditional crossing places to new crossing places. It increased the use of coyotes, or border smugglers, which had always been common and eventually became universal. Increased the cost of getting smuggled into the United States, and also increased the risk of death during border crossing. Now, you've changed a lot of objective conditions along the border, so this changes migrants' behavior. And what we found is that it had no effect on the likelihood of a first undocumented trip, at least that we could detect, but it decreased the likelihood of returning from a first undocumented trip, and decreased the likelihood of taking an additional trip, and decreased the likelihood of returning from an additional trip. So people would begin increasingly to take one trip and stay, rather than circulate back and forth. Now, to show this, I'm using data from the Mexican Migration Project, which is a project I've been running in Mexico with my colleague Jorge Durand since 1982. Every year we go into different communities around Mexico, do representative samples of those communities, collect complete data on who's in each household, and for every household we collect data from the head, the spouse, and all the children, whether they're living in that household or not, about their first and last trip to the United States, the total number of trips, and basic information about the first and last trips. And in addition, household heads provide a complete life history that includes a complete history of migration and border crossing. And we, to the extent we're able, we supplement these samples done in communities in Mexico with migrants from those same communities interviewed on the US side of the border. And what I'm going to do is estimate a series of statistical models, multivariate, where the main things we're going to focus on are the US context and the Mexican context. And the main variable of interest is a log of the Border Patrol's budget, which I have used two-stage least squares to instrument, using the DEA budget as an instrument for the increase in the Border Patrol's budget. The DEA is the budget rise, it occurred parallel, but through entirely different legislative tracks. That was the war on crime, which all was domestic politics against drugs in the US, and the war on immigrants was all about stopping the flows from Mexico and preventing this alien invasion. But they were correlated across time, and so I used one to instrument the other. We're also looking at the basic economic indicators, the rate of employment growth, the relative access to visas, residence and work visas in the thousands, the number that are accessible, US minimum daily wage, on the Mexican side, the crude birth rate, the rate of GDP growth, the homicide rate, and the Mexican minimum daily wage. And then at the individual level, we're controlling for all kinds of demographic, human capital characteristics, social capital characteristics, and so on. So it's a very ambitious model that we're estimating over time, looking at basically making use of all this life history data. Sometimes they're event history models, sometimes they're not. What I'm going to show you are estimates showing the observed outcome, which is the solid line. And this is the outcome that, holding everything else constant, one would expect to observe given the increase in border enforcement. So since we're using a two-stage least squares model, it's the causal effect of the ramping up of border enforcement on the outcome of interest. And what we're looking here is at the observed probability of crossing at a traditional border crossing, where traditional is here defined as El Paso or San Diego, Southern California or Eastern Texas or Western Texas. That's where 85% of the crossings have been, or 75% of the crossings had been. So you see, this is the observed from 1970 to around late 80s. The vast majority of crossings occurred at these places. Then that plummets and goes down. And this is the what we assert is the influence of the increase in border enforcement in producing that effect. This is the observed and predicted probability of crossing with a coyote. In 1970, it was very common, 3/4 or so crossed with a coyote, but by the end of the observation period, it becomes universal. And it's being driven up precisely by border enforcement. These are the costs of border crossing, the cost of hiring a coyote to get in the United States. For many years, it was about $500 a trip, and then it increases dramatically because you're shifting the crossings out of urbanized areas like El Paso and San Diego, pushing them through the Sonoran Desert into very remote hostile territory in Arizona, in Pima County, Arizona, in the southern part of Arizona. And that is a lot riskier, it's a lot more costly, requires a lot more infrastructure, you need safe houses on both sides. And when you cross the border into Arizona, you're 1,000 miles away from all the labor markets in California, and you're much closer to labor markets elsewhere or in the country. And so there was a permanent diversion of the flows away from California to other places or throughout the United States. And so the costs rise, the location of crossing rises, border crossing shifts. So the $64,000 question is what happened to the likelihood of getting apprehended at the border? And so what we see here is this is the probability of apprehension that we observe. It varies between about 0.2 and 0.4, averages around 0.33 over the period. And this is the effect of the border enforcement on the probability of apprehension. So it really doesn't have much of an effect on the likelihood that on any given attempt at crossing, you're going to get caught. And this is the probability of getting in over a series of attempts. So you get apprehended, you are repatriated, you try again. And you see that from 1970 through really around 2005, or so, the probability was basically 100%. So massive increase in border enforcement had no effect on the probability of entry, gaining a successful entry, or the probability of apprehension on any given trip. But it did have a big effect on the likelihood of dying. So this is a correlation between observed deaths at the border in numbers. I can't really do probabilities here because the Mexican Migration Project can't. If the person died crossing, we don't get to interview them. But using other data, this is just showing the relationship between the border enforcement effort and the number of deaths along the border as best we can calculate them. So we've created a new context for migrant decision-making along the border. Huge militarization of the border, which had the effect of pushing people away from California, away from traditional crossing points, through the Sonoran Desert into Arizona, dramatically increasing the costs, dramatically increasing the risks to injury and death, but not really affecting the likelihood that you'll get caught or likelihood that you'll ultimately get in. So what's a migrant to do? If all the risk is in the act of border crossing, the rational thing to do, if there's still jobs for you and there's still an economic benefit for you, the rational thing is to minimize border crossing. And you do this not by staying in Mexico and not gaining access to the economic benefits of immigration, but by staying in the United States and not going home to circulate once you've gotten across the border and paid the cost. So what we have here is the likelihood of taking a first undocumented trip to the United States to show that the border buildup, the massive increase in enforcement, really had very little effect on the probability of taking a first trip to the United States. This is the effect, and it's fairly flat and non-significant. And this is the observed trend. There's a lot of fluctuation, probabilities from year to year going to the United States, and this is estimated from dynamic event history models using retrospective life history data. And you see that these are really corresponding to shifts, ebbs and flows in the binational economy, conditions in Mexico, conditions in the United States. But you see that despite the shifts in the conditions, starting around 2000, there's a drop in the probability of taking a first trip to the United States. And that continues and continues and continues. And what's producing it? It's not the fundamental economic conditions. It's the demographic transition in Mexico. And this is the trend predicted from average age of people at risk of migrating. In the 1960s, the total fertility rate in Mexico was 7 children per woman. By 2000, it had dropped below 2.3 children per woman and was slowly gravitating down toward replacement level. 2013, it was 2.25 children per woman. What this means is that Mexico became an aging population, and labor force growth was decelerating. And the average age of people at risk of migrating keeps going up and up and up. The average age in Mexico is now about 28 years old. We know from years of demographic research on the age patterns of migration, that migration is concentrated between the ages of 15 and 30. Rises sharply in the late teens, peaks around age 20, declines, and then falls rapidly in the late 20s. And if you don't migrate between the ages of 15 and 30, you don't start migrating at all. And so now with an average age of the entire population of 28 years, people are moving out of the migrant-prone ages. And if you look at people age 15 and above, those that are really at risk of taking a first trip to the United States, the average age is up into the 30s, late 30s. So basically, Mexico's aging out of the migrant-prone ages. Average age is increasing. Demographic transition has occurred. Mexico's becoming an aging society, and that has driven down the level of migration to the United States, undocumented migration to the United States, to very, very low levels. And in 2008, as far as we can tell, Mexican migration, undocumented migration ceased. The undocumented population fell by 1 million people. Since 2009, it has remained fairly stable at around 11 million people. And this is entirely, as you can see, consistent with the data that we produce. This is totally independent data from those aggregate estimates that are done both by Homeland Security and by the Pew Hispanic Trust. And basically, we come to the same conclusions with the data from the Mexican Migration Project. This looks at the, to show you that this is the observed trend downward, the probability of taking a first undocumented trip, which we saw before. And this is the probability from this is the line for all factors in the model, including the rising average age. This is the line if only the US fundamentals were operating and everything else was held constant. And this is the line that results if it's only the Mexican fundamentals working. So if the economic fundamentals haven't changed that much, and if other things equal, they would continue to produce a flow from Mexico to the United States of undocumented migrants. But what really changed was the average age, which pushed the whole thing downward. Finally, the kicker is that while the massive increase in border enforcement had no influence that we can detect on the likelihood of leaving for an undocumented trip towards the border, or getting apprehended at the border, or crossing at the border, it had a marked effect in reducing the likelihood that you returned once you were there. So we see as the likelihood of returning within 12 months of an undocumented entry. Historically, it was about 0.45 or so. Starting with the Immigration Reform and Control Act, it begins to decline, and it goes down. And if we carry this out past 2010, the numbers get small because very few people are leaving. The probability is really down, approaching zero. So from 1986 to 2010, the US spent $35 billion in constant 2013 dollars in border enforcement. And in doing so, it transformed what had been a circular flow of male workers going to 3 states into a settled population of families living in 50 states by diverting the flows away from California in particular, and by dramatically reducing the probability of return migration while not having any influence on the probability of in-migration. Reduced out-migration while leaving in-migration unchanged, doubled the net rate of undocumented migration and population growth, and created the current population of 11 million undocumented residents. 60% are Mexican Americans, and 2/3 undocumented migrants now constitute 60% of all Mexican immigrants and about 2/3 of all Central American immigrants, and all while attempting to end an undocumented flow that would have ended of its own accord after 2000 because of the demographic transition in Mexico. And this is the result you get. This is, you're standing on a hill with your back to the Pacific Ocean, looking eastward. The left is the United States, the right is Tijuana. And you can see that there's a wall there. And Donald Trump wants to make that wall 2,000 miles long. even though illegal migration from Mexico stopped 8 years ago, even though when there was a flow, it had the counterproductive effect of keeping people in the country rather than letting them circulate back and forth, and drove up the rate of population growth. And why is this? Why, if illegal migration is stopped now for 8 years, why is there so much insistence, particularly in the Republican Party? All the candidates want more border enforcement and want more walls. Well, we've had a complete change in political dialogue, and well, this is the Korean DMZ, just by for comparison, another testament to political success. The border's become this gigantic symbol. It's the way that politicians, particularly in the Republican Party, symbolically reassure Americans that they're working to protect them from all kinds of threats. And it doesn't matter what the threat is. So during the 1980s, it was communists. And I recommend you see the movie Red Dawn if you want to get a sense of the zeitgeist at this period. The premise of the movie is that the U.S. is invaded by paratroopers dropping into the middle of the United States with Spanish-speaking troops and Russian officers, and they're taking over the United States, and the wrestling team goes off into the Rockies and becomes a guerrilla war band to help liberate America. That was the zeitgeist, and that was the Cold War. The height of the Cold War, the Sandinistas were in power, the communists were going to inflate. Then it became a cultural threat. The Mexicans weren't going to integrate. The Mexicans weren't going to learn English. It was part of a war on the middle class. It was what Pat Buchanan called the Asylum plot, hatched by Mexican elites to re-annex the lands they lost in the Mexico-U.S. War in 1848. And now it's Al-Qaeda. So when you're afraid of Al-Qaeda, what does the politician do? Oh, let's militarize the border with Mexico. Let's shut down the border with Mexico. Because we all know there's so many Islamic people living in Mexico. And, you know, if you were Al-Qaeda, where would you set up a terrorist cell to attack the United States? Would you go to Tijuana, where you face the most militarized border anywhere in the world, stick out like a sore thumb and the narcos would kill you? Or would you go to Toronto, where there's a large Islamic population, known terrorist cells? Terrorist cells have been convicted in federal court of trying to infiltrate the United States to bomb. And when comes time to launch your little terrorist plot, the border is wide open. You can row across the lake. You can drive across the border. You can sneak across a wooded part. It's relative to the Mexico border, it's completely undefended. But no, we never talk about militarizing the border with Canada. We talk about militarizing the border with Mexico. And that's because Mexico-U.S. border has become the symbol, and it's no accident that most Americans imagine people south of the border to be brown-skinned and people north of the border to be light-skinned. But of course, most Americans don't know that the foreign-born percentage of Canada is twice that of the United States, and the average resident of Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver are increasingly not white Europeans, but that's beside the point. So politicians play on this trope. We know Al-Qaeda has camps over with the drug cartels on the other side of the Mexican border. We know that people are now being trained to come in and act like Hispanics when they're radical Islamic. It's just insane not to protect ourselves. And now it's ISIS. So Rick Perry said that there's ISIS camps. Representative Duncan of South Carolina. It's all about the war against ISIS. And then during the Ebola scare, we need to close the border to protect ourselves from Ebola because there are so many flights from West Africa into Mexico that it's a natural channel for infiltration of the germs across the border. So this is where it's all brought us. The United States ended up creating an undocumented population is now a permanent feature of American society. The average undocumented migrant has now been present in the United States for 18 years. A majority now have US-born citizen children. This is one of the biggest political stumbling blocks in the country at the moment. The Republican Party has articulated universally an anti-immigrant rhetoric that will offer no pathway to legalization to the 11 million people who are out of status, and are insisting on even more border enforcement and a border wall when the problem no longer really exists. The United States is in the middle of a nasty white anti-immigrant, anti-black reaction. We're seeing the fruits of that right now. So it's largely a self-inflicted wound. Our border policy was a failure. It was proved to be counterproductive rather than solving the problem, made it worse. And the debate still continues to revolve around how we can continue to reinforce and militarize a border that's already the most secure border anywhere between two trading nations in the world.